She was on her knees, scrubbing his floor, when he looked down at her and laughed. He called her stupid. He mocked her in front of everyone. He had no idea that the woman holding that mop had a PhD from Cambridge. He didn't know she was about to take everything from him. This is the true story of how a billionaire humiliated the wrong person and lost his entire empire because of it. What happens next will make you never look at people the same way again. Stay with me, because the revenge she gets is absolutely legendary. Welcome to Voice of Granny. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you're watching from. Let me tell you a story that will change the way you look at people forever. Have you ever walked past someone cleaning floors or serving food and barely noticed them? Have you ever judged someone just because of the job they do? Well, this story is about a man who made that mistake. And it cost him everything. This happened in London, in one of those fancy private clubs where the rich and powerful meet. You know the type? Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's cars. The kind of place where you need connections just to walk through the door. Her name was Sophie Bennett. 26 years old, quiet, with gentle eyes hidden behind simple glasses. Every evening, she would arrive at the Wellington Club wearing her cleaning uniform, a plain gray dress with the club's logo stitched on the pocket. She would mop the floors, empty the bins, and wipe down the tables after the wealthy members finished their meetings. To everyone there, she was invisible. Just another cleaner. Someone to ignore. But Sophie was so much more than that. On this particular night, the club was hosting a special dinner. The main guest was Thomas Ashford, a 42-year-old property developer who had made billions buying up land across London. He was the kind of man who wore his wealth like armor. Expensive watches, designer suits, shoes so shiny you could see your reflection. He owned half the buildings in central London, and he made sure everyone knew it. Thomas sat at the center table with his business partners, laughing loudly, drinking wine that cost more per bottle than Sophie earned in a month. His voice carried across the entire room as he told stories about his latest deals, about the companies he had crushed, the families he had evicted to build luxury apartments. Sophie was cleaning nearby, quietly wiping down the tables that had already been cleared. She kept her head down, moving like a shadow. Then Thomas noticed her. "You there," he called out, snapping his fingers in her direction. "Come here." Sophie looked up. Her heart began to pound, but she walked over calmly. "Yes, sir?" Thomas leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile spreading across his face. He had been drinking, and he was bored. His friends were talking business, and he wanted entertainment. "Tell me something," Thomas said, looking her up and down. "What goes through your mind when you're mopping floors? Do you ever think about anything complicated? Or is it just mop, rinse, repeat?" His friends chuckled. Sophie stood still, her hands gripping the cleaning cloth. "I think about many things, sir," she said quietly. "Many things." Thomas repeated, mocking her. "Like what? Which bin to empty next?" More laughter from the table. Thomas picked up a napkin and drew a quick diagram on it with his expensive fountain pen. "Let me test something. I'm working on a development project right now. I'm buying a building for £80 million. The property value is dropping by 6% every year because of structural issues, but the land value is rising by 4% annually. There's also a government tax that kicks in if the total value exceeds a certain threshold." He looked up at her, his eyes gleaming with mockery. "So tell me, cleaner, in 5 years, will this property be worth more or less than what I paid? And by how much?" The entire room had gone quiet. Other members were watching now, some looking uncomfortable, others smirking. Sophie looked at the napkin. Her mind, the mind that had once solved complex mathematical proofs at Cambridge University, immediately saw the answer. She saw the curves, the intersections, the exact point where the values would cross. But she also saw something Thomas didn't know she could see. She saw the name of the building on his napkin. Hartley Tower. And her heart nearly stopped. Because Sophie knew that building. Her father had owned that building. 10 years ago, Sophie's father, Richard Bennett, had been a respected property owner in London. He had spent his life building a small portfolio of buildings, treating his tenants fairly, maintaining the properties with care. He wasn't rich like Thomas, but he was honest and hardworking. Then Thomas Ashford had wanted Hartley Tower. He wanted the land it sat on to build a luxury hotel. When Richard refused to sell, Thomas destroyed him. He used his connections to create false building inspections, invented structural problems that didn't exist, spread rumors about Richard's financial troubles. Banks stopped lending. Tenants fled. Richard lost everything trying to fight the lies. The stress killed him. He died of a heart attack 3 years ago, broken and disgraced. Sophie had been forced to drop out of Cambridge in her final year. Her mathematics PhD, her research, her dreams, all gone. She had taken whatever jobs she could find to support her sick mother. Cleaning jobs. Invisible jobs. And now, here she stood, face to face with the man who had destroyed her family. Thomas was still waiting, tapping his pen impatiently. Well, too difficult for you? It's all right, I don't expect someone like you to understand. Sophie looked at him. And in that moment, she made a decision. The property will be worth approximately £72 million, she said quietly. You'll lose about £8 million, not including the renovation costs you haven't factored in. Thomas's smile faded. What? The 6% depreciation compounds annually, Sophie continued, her voice growing steadier. But the land appreciation is calculated on the original land value, not the total property value. They're two separate equations. You're treating them as one, which is why your projection is wrong. The room was completely silent now. Thomas stared at her. You're guessing. I'm calculating, Sophie said. And I'm right. She turned and walked away, leaving Thomas sitting there, his face red with anger and confusion. But Sophie wasn't done. Not even close. Because she had just realized something. If Thomas was still making these kinds of mistakes, if he was still this arrogant, this careless, then maybe, just maybe, she could do more than just embarrass him. Maybe she could bring him down completely. That night, Sophie didn't sleep. She sat in her tiny flat in East London, the place she shared with her mother, and she thought about what had happened. Her hands were still shaking, not from fear, but from something else. Anger, purpose, hope. For 3 years, she had been invisible. She had cleaned floors and emptied bins and pretended that her brain, that brilliant mind that had once impressed professors at Cambridge, didn't exist. She had hidden herself away because the world had taught her that fighting back was useless. But tonight, something had changed. Thomas Ashford had looked at her and seen nothing. He had made the same mistake everyone made. He judged her by her uniform, by her job, by the way she looked. He thought he could humiliate her for entertainment. He had no idea who she really was. Sophie opened her old laptop, the one she'd kept from her university days. It was slow and outdated, but it still worked. She logged into the research databases she still had access to through her old student account, and she started searching. She searched for everything she could find about Thomas Ashford and his company, Ashford Property Group. What she found made her heart race. Thomas wasn't just wealthy, he was reckless. His company's financial records, the ones available to the public, showed a pattern. He was over-leveraged, borrowing massive amounts of money to buy properties, betting that land values would keep rising forever. He was like a gambler who kept winning and thought he couldn't lose. But Sophie could see the cracks. There was a particular deal he was working on right now. Riverside Plaza, a massive development project on the Thames. He was planning to buy the entire block, demolish everything, and build luxury apartments. The project was worth £300 million, and Thomas had borrowed most of that money from banks. But here's what Sophie noticed. The deal depended on getting planning permission from the local council. And the vote was scheduled for next month. If the council rejected the plan, Thomas would be stuck with buildings he couldn't develop and loans he couldn't repay. His entire company would collapse like a house of cards. Sophie leaned back in her chair, her mind working through the possibilities. She couldn't stop the council vote. She wasn't a politician, she wasn't a lawyer. She was just a cleaner. But maybe she didn't need to stop the vote. Maybe she just needed to show people who Thomas Ashford really was. Over the next 2 weeks, Sophie did something she had never done before. She became a spy in plain sight. As she cleaned the Wellington Club each evening, she paid attention. She listened to conversations. She watched where Thomas sat, who he met with, what documents he left on tables. Nobody noticed her. Why would they? She was just the cleaner. One night, she overheard Thomas talking to a council member named Geoffrey Winters. They were sitting in a private corner, speaking in low voices, but Sophie was cleaning a table just behind them. The vote is next Thursday, Geoffrey said nervously. I can probably swing 3 other members to vote yes, but it's going to be close. Make it happen, Thomas said coldly. I've already transferred the first payment to your account. The rest comes after the vote goes through. Sophie's blood ran cold. Thomas was bribing a government official. That night, she made a recording on her phone. Just their voices, muffled but clear enough. But a recording alone wouldn't be enough. Thomas had lawyers, power, connections. He could claim the recording was fake or taken out of context. Sophie needed something bigger. She needed to expose him in a way he couldn't deny, couldn't spin, couldn't escape. And then she had an idea. She remembered something from her university days. Her professor had once told her, "The best way to catch someone in a lie is to make them commit to it publicly, in front of witnesses, in a way they can't take back." Thomas was hosting a public presentation next week at the Wellington Club. He was unveiling his Riverside Plaza project to investors and journalists. It was going to be a big event with cameras, reporters, and wealthy potential investors. Sophie realized this was her chance. She spent the next week preparing. She studied every detail of Thomas's development plan. She analyzed the financial projections, the construction timeline, the environmental impact reports. And she found problems, big problems. Thomas's plan claimed the development would create 2,000 jobs. But Sophie did the math, and the numbers didn't add up. The construction would actually eliminate more jobs than it created by displacing local businesses. His environmental report claimed minimal impact on the Thames wildlife. But Sophie found evidence that the construction would destroy a protected wetland area, which was illegal. His financial projections claimed the apartments would sell for premium prices. But Sophie analyzed the market data and realized he was overestimating by at least 30%. The apartments wouldn't sell, which meant the investors would lose their money. Everything about Thomas's plan was a lie. A beautiful, expensive lie designed to make him richer while destroying a community and bankrupting his investors. Sophie printed everything out. She organized it into a clear, simple presentation that anyone could understand. Charts, graphs, highlighted sections of legal documents. And then she did something bold. She called the local newspaper, the Thames Gazette, and spoke to a journalist named Oliver Price. She told him she had evidence of corruption and fraud in the Riverside Plaza development. She told him to come to the presentation next week. "Who are you?" Oliver had asked. "Someone who knows the truth," Sophie had said. "Just be there. You won't regret it." The night before the presentation, Sophie stood in front of her small mirror, looking at her reflection. She was terrified. She was about to go up against one of the most powerful men in London. But she was also ready, because she wasn't just a cleaner anymore. She was someone who had been invisible for too long. And tomorrow, she was going to make sure everyone saw her. The day of the presentation arrived with gray London skies and a cold wind that rattled the windows of the Wellington Club. Sophie arrived early, as she always did, wearing her cleaning uniform. She pushed her cart through the main hall, which had been transformed for the event. A stage had been set up at the front, with a large projection screen and rows of chairs for the audience. Waiters were setting up champagne tables. Camera crews were testing their equipment. Thomas Ashford stood near the stage, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than Sophie earned in 6 months. He was laughing with someone confident and relaxed. Why wouldn't he be? This was his moment of triumph. Sophie kept her head down and cleaned, just as she always did. Invisible. By 7 o'clock, the room was packed. Investors in expensive suits. Journalists with cameras and notepads. Local council members, including Geoffrey Winters, who sat near the front looking nervous. Even some celebrities had shown up. Thomas knew how to throw a party. Oliver Price from the Thames Gazette was there too, sitting in the back row. He kept looking around, searching for the mysterious source who had called him. Thomas stepped onto the stage, and the room fell silent. He smiled that big, confident smile. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice booming through the speakers. "Tonight, I'm going to show you the future of London. Riverside Plaza isn't just a development, it's a revolution. Luxury living on the Thames, creating thousands of jobs, bringing wealth and prosperity to a neglected area." The screen behind him lit up with beautiful computer-generated images. Gleaming apartment towers, landscaped gardens, happy families walking along the river. "This project represents £300 million of investment," Thomas continued. "And I'm inviting you all to be part of it. The return on investment will be extraordinary." The audience murmured appreciatively. Sophie watched from the back of the room, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. Thomas clicked to the next slide. "Now, let me show you the financial projections." "Excuse me," a voice called out. Everyone turned. Sophie had raised her hand. Thomas squinted into the lights, trying to see who had spoken. "Yes. Do you have a question?" Sophie stood up. In her cleaning uniform, with her hair tied back and her glasses reflecting the stage lights, she looked so out of place that people actually laughed. I said yes. Do you have a question? Thomas repeated, annoyed now. I do, Sophie said, her voice shaking but clear. Your financial projections are wrong. The laughter died. Thomas stared at her. I'm sorry, who are you? I'm Sophie Bennett, she said, walking down the aisle toward the stage. I clean this building every night. And I've reviewed your entire development plan. It's built on lies. The room erupted. People were talking, journalists were grabbing their cameras. Thomas's face turned red. Security, he shouted. Remove this woman immediately. But Sophie was already at the front. She pulled out a folder from under her cleaning apron and held it up. Before you throw me out, you might want to hear what I have to say. Because everything I'm about to tell you can be verified. And the journalists in this room are recording everything. Thomas looked at the cameras pointing at him. He was trapped. If he had her dragged out now, it would look like he was hiding something. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. You have 2 minutes. Then you're gone. Sophie opened her folder with trembling hands. You claim this development will create 2,000 jobs. But according to the construction timeline and the businesses currently operating in the area, you'll actually eliminate over 3,000 jobs. Small shops, family businesses, local services, all gone. She held up a document. This is the business registry for the Riverside area. I've counted them. 37 businesses employing 3,200 people. Your plan mentions none of them. Thomas tried to interrupt, but Sophie kept going. You claim minimal environmental impact. But your construction site includes a protected wetland habitat. Building there is illegal without special permission, which you don't have. This is the Environmental Protection Order from the London Council. She held up another document. And your financial projections claim these apartments will sell for an average of £800,000 each. But the actual market data for similar properties in that area shows an average price of $550,000. You're overestimating by 45%. Sophie looked directly at Thomas. Which means the investors in this room won't see profits. They'll see losses. Huge losses. The room was in chaos now. Investors were standing up, demanding answers. Journalists were shouting questions. Thomas stepped forward, his face twisted with rage. This is ridiculous. Who is going to believe a cleaner over me? I have experts, consultants, lawyers who've reviewed every detail. Then explain this, Sophie said. She pulled out her phone and pressed play. Thomas's voice filled the room through the speaker system. Make it happen. I've already transferred the first payment to your account. The rest comes after the vote goes through. Jeffrey Winters, the council member, stood up so fast his chair fell over. His face was white as chalk. That recording is illegal. Thomas shouted. This is entrapment. It's a voice recording in a public space. Oliver Price called out from the back. Perfectly legal. And I'm printing this story tonight. Thomas turned to the audience, trying to salvage the situation. Look, this woman has a grudge against me. Her father. My father owned Hartley Tower, Sophie said loudly, cutting him off. The building you fraudulently seized 10 years ago. You fabricated building violations. You bribed inspectors. You destroyed his reputation and his business. And the stress killed him. She walked closer to the stage, looking up at Thomas. You thought I was just a cleaner. Someone too stupid to understand your complicated business deals. But I understood every word. I saw every lie. And now everyone else sees them too. Thomas stood frozen on the stage. For the first time in his life, he had no words. No clever comeback. No way to spin the situation. The vote on Riverside Plaza is postponed indefinitely, one of the council members announced, standing up. We'll be launching a full investigation. Thomas's phone started ringing. And ringing. And ringing. His investors pulling out. His lawyers calling emergency meetings. His empire beginning to crumble. Sophie turned and walked out of the Wellington Club for the last time. She never had to clean another floor. The next 48 hours were a storm. Sophie's confrontation at the Wellington Club had been recorded by a dozen cameras. By morning, the video was everywhere, on news websites, social media, television broadcasts. The footage of a cleaner in a gray uniform standing up to a billionaire developer spread around the world. Cleaner exposes billionaire's fraud, read the headlines. David versus Goliath in London property scandal. The woman they underestimated. Sophie sat in her small flat, watching the news on her old television, trying to process what was happening. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Journalists wanted interviews. Lawyers wanted to talk. Even job offers were coming in from companies, from universities, from organizations she'd never heard of. Her mother, sitting in her wheelchair beside her, squeezed her hand. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered, tears in her eyes. Meanwhile, across London in his luxury penthouse, Thomas Ashford was watching his world collapse. The Thames Gazette had published a devastating investigation. Oliver Price had spent the last 2 days digging, and with Sophie's evidence as a starting point, he'd uncovered a decade of corruption. Bribes to council members, fraudulent building inspections, falsified environmental reports, tax evasion through offshore accounts. But the Riverside Plaza scandal was just the beginning. Other people started coming forward. Families who had been evicted from properties Thomas had bought. Business owners who had been forced out. Tenants who had lived in buildings with dangerous conditions while Thomas collected rent and ignored repairs. The story wasn't just about one corrupt deal anymore. It was about a system that had allowed a wealthy man to hurt people for years without consequences. And the financial markets had noticed. Thomas's company, Ashford Property Group, saw its stock price collapse. Investors were fleeing. Banks that had loaned him hundreds of millions of pounds were calling in their debts. Credit lines were frozen. Projects were cancelled. 3 days after Sophie's revelation, the police arrested Jeffrey Winters, the council member, for accepting bribes. And during questioning, he gave them everything. Names, dates, bank transfers, all pointing to Thomas. Thomas's lawyers told him to prepare for criminal charges. Fraud, bribery, corruption. Each charge carried years in prison. But perhaps the worst part for Thomas wasn't the legal trouble. It was the humiliation. He had built his entire identity on being smarter than everyone else, richer than everyone else, more powerful than everyone else. He had walked into rooms and commanded respect, or at least fear. Now, when people saw him, they saw a fool. The billionaire outsmarted by a cleaner. Late one night, Thomas sat alone in his penthouse, surrounded by newspapers with his face on the front page. His phone was off. His friends had stopped calling. His business partners had distanced themselves. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and walked to the window, looking out at the London skyline. All those buildings, and he'd once thought he owned this city. He thought about Sophie, that quiet woman with the glasses who he'd mocked in front of everyone. He'd thought she was nothing. How had he been so wrong? The worst part was he remembered it now, vaguely, like a half-forgotten dream. 10 years ago, when he'd been destroying Richard Bennett's business, someone had mentioned that Bennett had a daughter. A bright girl studying mathematics at Cambridge. Thomas had never given it a second thought. Why would he? She was just a detail, unimportant. He'd never imagined that detail would destroy him. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Thomas opened it to find 2 police detectives standing in the hallway. "Thomas Ashford," one of them said formally, "we have a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, bribery of public officials, and falsification of legal documents." Thomas didn't run. He didn't shout. He didn't call his lawyers. He just nodded, held out his wrists for the handcuffs, and let them lead him away. As the police car drove through London that night, Thomas looked out the window at the streets he'd once dominated. And for the first time in his life, he felt small. Meanwhile, Sophie's life was changing in ways she never expected. The University of Cambridge called. They wanted her to come back and finish her PhD. They offered her a full scholarship, plus a research grant, plus a formal apology for not doing more to help her family 10 years ago. Law firms called, offering her consulting positions. They wanted her analytical mind to review complex financial cases. A technology company offered her a job as their head of data analysis, with a salary that made her gasp. But the offer that made her smile came from the Riverside Community Association. The local residents, the ones who would have lost their homes and businesses to Thomas's development, invited her to a meeting. When Sophie arrived at the small community center, she expected maybe a dozen people. Instead, she found over 200 people packed into the hall. Families, business owners, elderly residents, children. They gave her a standing ovation. The chairwoman, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson who ran the local bookshop, took Sophie's hands. "You saved us," she said simply. "We've been fighting Thomas Ashford for 2 years. We wrote letters, we protested, we went to council meetings. Nobody listened. We were just ordinary people, and he was a billionaire. But you," Mrs. Patterson continued, her eyes bright with tears, "you were one of us. And you showed everyone that it doesn't matter what job you do or how much money you have. What matters is the truth. Sophie looked around the room at all these faces. People who had been invisible to men like Thomas. People who worked hard, who loved their community, who deserved to be heard. He thought I was nobody, Sophie said softly. But nobody is nobody. We all matter. Every single one of us. The room erupted in cheers. That night, as Sophie walked home through the streets of London, she realized something. She wasn't invisible anymore. But more importantly, she'd helped make sure other people weren't invisible either. She'd shown the world that the person cleaning the floor might be smarter than the person sitting at the head of the table. And that's a lesson some people would never forget. 6 months later, London looked different to Sophie. Or maybe Sophie looked different at London. She sat in a corner office at Cambridge University, her PhD certificate hanging on the wall beside her research awards. Outside her window, students crossed the courtyard, their arms full of books, their faces full of dreams. Sophie was now Dr. Sophie Bennett. She'd completed her PhD in 3 intensive months, writing a thesis that her professors called brilliant and groundbreaking. It was about game theory and economic justice. Specifically, how small players could defeat larger opponents using information asymmetry. In other words, she'd written about exactly what she'd done to Thomas Ashford. But Sophie hadn't stopped there. She'd taken the consulting money from her new job and started something she'd been dreaming about for months. She called it the Equity Project. It was a free legal and financial advisory service for ordinary people facing powerful opponents. Small business owners being pushed out by developers. Tenants living in unsafe housing with landlords who wouldn't make repairs. Workers being exploited by wealthy employers. Sophie would review their cases, analyze the numbers, find the weaknesses in their opponents' arguments. And then she'd connect them with lawyers, journalists, and advocates who could help them fight back. In just 6 months, the Equity Project had helped 37 families keep their homes. 23 small businesses stay open. 12 workers win unfair dismissal cases. People started calling her the people's mathematician. Sophie smiled at that. She remembered when Thomas had asked her if she ever thought about anything complicated while mopping floors. If only he'd known that the woman holding the mop was thinking about how to destroy him. The trial of Thomas Ashford took place on a cold morning in November. Sophie sat in the public gallery, watching as the man who had once seemed so powerful sat at the defendant's table. He looked older now, tired. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a simple gray jacket. The arrogance had disappeared, leaving behind only a shell of a man. The prosecutor presented the evidence. The bribes, the fraud, the years of corruption. Witness after witness took the stand. Jeffrey Winters, the council member, testified about the payments. Former employees testified about falsified documents. Families testified about being illegally evicted. And then Sophie was called to the stand. She walked to the witness box, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor was gentle with her. Ms. Bennett, or should I say Dr. Bennett, can you explain how you first became aware of Mr. Ashford's fraudulent activities? Sophie took a breath. He humiliated me publicly at the Wellington Club. He gave me a mathematics problem, expecting me to fail. When I solved it, he became angry. That's when I realized he was more interested in making people feel small than in being right. And what did you do then? I decided to look more carefully at his business dealings. I used my training in mathematics to analyze his financial projections. And I found that nothing added up. The numbers were designed to look impressive, but they were fundamentally flawed. The prosecutor nodded. You could have simply walked away. You could have found another job. Why did you choose to expose him? Sophie looked at Thomas. He was staring at the table, refusing to meet her eyes. Because of my father, Sophie said quietly. Richard Bennett. He was a good man. An honest man. And Thomas Ashford destroyed him simply because he wanted what my father had built. He used lies and corruption, and when my father tried to fight back, he was crushed. Her voice grew stronger. My father died believing he had failed, believing he had done something wrong. But he hadn't. He was just a decent person who ran into someone who had no decency at all. I exposed Thomas Ashford because people like him only win when everyone else stays quiet. When we let them make us invisible. When we accept that wealth equals power and power equals truth. Sophie looked directly at Thomas now. I wanted to show that truth is truth, regardless of who speaks it. Whether it's a billionaire developer or a cleaner with a mop. The courtroom was silent. The defense lawyer tried to discredit her, suggesting she had acted out of revenge, that her evidence was biased. But every piece of evidence Sophie had provided was verified by experts. Every calculation she'd made was correct. Every document she'd found was real. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They found Thomas Ashford guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in prison and ordered him to pay millions in restitution to the people he'd harmed. As the guards led Thomas away, he finally looked at Sophie. Just for a moment, their eyes met. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel joy. She felt something quieter, like a weight lifting, like justice finally after so many years. That evening, Sophie visited her father's grave. She knelt in the grass and placed flowers on the headstone. Richard Bennett, it read. Loving father. Honest man. I did it, Dad, Sophie whispered. I proved you weren't wrong. You weren't weak. You were just up against someone who fought dirty. The wind rustled through the trees, and Sophie felt peaceful for the first time in years. As she walked out of the cemetery, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Mrs. Patterson, the bookshop owner from Riverside. Dr. Bennett, we just heard the verdict. We're having a celebration at the community center tonight. You're the guest of honor. Please come. Sophie smiled and typed back, I'll be there. Because that's where she belonged. Not in fancy clubs with marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Not in boardrooms with powerful men making decisions that affected people's lives. But with ordinary people. Good people. People who worked hard and loved their families and deserved to be seen. As Sophie walked through the streets of London that evening, heading toward Riverside, she thought about everything that had happened. A year ago, she had been invisible. A cleaner no one noticed, no one respected. Now she was visible. But more importantly, she'd made sure others were visible too. She'd learned the most important lesson of all. Everyone has value. Everyone has worth. Everyone deserves dignity. It doesn't matter if you're wearing an expensive suit or a cleaning uniform. It doesn't matter if you have millions in the bank or barely enough for rent. What matters is how you treat people. What matters is truth. And Sophie Bennett had made sure the truth was heard. The cleaner had cleaned up more than floors. She'd cleaned up corruption. And in doing so, she'd reminded everyone that the people we overlook might just be the ones who change everything. Remember, never judge someone by their job. Never assume someone is less intelligent because they're in a service role. And never, ever underestimate the power of someone who has been underestimated their whole life. Because the person you dismiss today might be the person who brings you down tomorrow. This story reminds us that dignity isn't about what you do for a living. It's about how you live. Sophie won not because she was smarter, though she was. She won because she had something Thomas Ashford never had: integrity, persistence, and the courage to stand up when everyone expected her to stay invisible. What would you do in Sophie's position? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have fought back? Let me know in the comments below.